Good morning, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today for our webinar series, I Safety webinar series. My name's Craig Peterson. I'm an aviation safety advisor with CASA, work out of the Perth office, and we do these sessions quite regularly, both in person and online. So this is our latest webinar. It's on flight reviews. With these and our in-person webinars, what we do is just use them as an opportunity to pause what we're doing with our flying, reflect on how we're doing our flying, and think about things that we might be able to learn from some of the stuff that's happening out there that we can incorporate in our own flying to make things safer and more efficient. So if you've been to one of the online sessions before or one of our in-person sessions before, you'll know that the idea is that at the end of the day, hopefully you walk away with one or two things at least that you think, yeah, that's maybe something I've become a bit complacent in, or I could work on a bit harder to make my flying, that little bit safer. So the webinar format isn't quite as interactive as our in-person format, but that's okay. We can still get around that. We just need to think about how we do things and just a few little rules and stuff that'll make things run a bit smoother. One thing I do want to point out before we start is that we record these sessions so that we can then put them up onto the CASA website for people who weren't able to join us to view. So keep that in mind if you're asking your questions or you want to make comments and all that, that it will be recorded. So a couple of points just to start us off. You may have noticed that you can't unmute your microphone or camera. We do that just to keep things running smoothly. So at the moment, you won't be able to unmute your microphone or your camera, but when we get to the questions section, if you have a question, we'll explain how to do that so that you'll be able to ask your question if you've got one. If you're familiar with Teams, you can open up the chat window, and if you're not familiar with Teams, if you look up on the top taskbar above your Teams window there's a little speech bubble with chat. You can open that and the chat will open on the right-hand side. So you can use that to ask questions, make comments. At the end of the session, both presenters today will be referring to things like the MOS, Part 61, ATSB accident case studies. I'm going to put some links up there in the chat section for you that you can use to go and find that information if you want to refer back to it. I'll also put my email in there as well if you've got residual questions after we've finished. So that's a comments section. Feel free to open that if you wish. When it comes to asking questions, to just keep it a little bit under control, we'll get you to raise your hand. If you don't know how to do that, if you look up on top of your taskbar there again, there's a little hand with raise. You just hit that button. Our IT specialist, Jenna, will see that you want a question, you've got a question to ask, and I'll nominate you. She'll unmute your microphone. You can go ahead and ask your question. So that's a good way to attract our attention there. So you don't need to worry about unmuting your mask. Jenna will do that. Your mic, Jenna will do that for you. And as I mentioned, I'll be putting those links for that information that we're talking about in there for your reference later on. So also what we started doing with our seminars, particularly the online ones, is issuing a digital badge to people who attend. It's a record for you to show that you've attended this seminar, and you can use it in your email signatures, digital resumes, social media, etc. So to be eligible for that little digital badge for this flight review presentation, all you have to do is stay to the end of the webinar. You don't even have to stay awake. I can't see if you're sleeping, can't see your cameras. So yeah, if you're here at the end of the session, you'll get an email, and if you want to grab that badge, you're more than welcome to do that. So what are we going to cover today? We're talking about flight reviews today. So we're going to start off by looking at why we do flight reviews, and particularly why we do them from a safety perspective. What's the purpose of them? We'll then talk about a couple of case studies where flight reviews were seen to be one of the many causal factors for a particular accident type. And a couple of words on the case studies we're talking about today. Unfortunately, they both are fatal accidents. And it's quite unpleasant talking about fatal accidents, but I think it's really important from our perspectives as aviators that we do that. We need to dissect what happened, learn those lessons from the accidents, and make sure that, we don't fall into the same traps. We don't look at these case studies with the view to point the finger of blame and say, well, gee, how could that pilot do that? Rather, we look at it and we say, these were people like you and I. How do we avoid falling into the same traps that these people sort of fell into? I'm also aware that, aviation in Australia is a relatively small community, and it's entirely possible that you may have known someone involved in these accident case studies or been some way involved. The last thing we want to do is cause anyone any distress. So if either of our two case studies is something that's going to cause you some distress, please feel free to just move away from the computer for 5 to 10 minutes, grab a cup of coffee or tea, and then come back and join us when you're ready. We'll then talk about the legalities of flight reviews. And today we're very lucky to be joined by our special guest, Jared Rowe. Jared is the head of operations for the Royal Aero Club of WA, very experienced flight instructor and flight examiner. And he's going to be telling us some of the things that he's seen with flight reviews over the years, things like best ways to prepare for them, what to expect, common errors and the like. We'll then have a quick summary at the end, and then we'll do a question and answer session, and that's where you can identify yourselves with that little raise hand button. And if you've got some questions, or if you want to share some relevant experiences that you've had in this area, then please feel free to do so. So, purpose of flight reviews. Well, first of all, I think we've got to think back to our human factors studies. We know that when we look at the human body and brain combination, it's never really designed to put ourselves in aeroplanes and move at quite high speeds at sometimes quite high altitudes. So we're developing a lot of technical and non-technical skills to be able to fly safely, and our training system does that. But one thing that the human factors study shows is that those skills are perishable. If we don't use them often, for example, we can get rusty and those skills will diminish somewhat. Even if we're using them often, if we're not standardised, then we can deviate from a good standard and start to create what's called normalisation of deviance. Procedures that are not quite correct or not quite safe can creep into our flying. So it's very important that we recognise that no matter how experienced we are, how many hours we've got in our logbook, the skills that we use to fly are perishable. The airlines have known that for quite some time. They have very rigid training and check systems to keep their pilots at the appropriate level of competency. So your typical airline pilot will be doing quite a inclusive and extensive test and check of their skills every 6 months, whether that be through a yearly check or an operational check every 6 months. So they've recognised it for a long time, and they have really good systems in place to deal with that aspect. Whereas we, as recreational and private pilots, don't necessarily have that umbrella over us. Now, of course, our risk profile is quite different. We don't have 300 or 400 people in the back of our aircraft flying in all sorts of weather to all sorts of different strips. But still, there is risk there if our skills perish. So that's why the flight review system is there. It gives us an opportunity every couple of years to have someone who is competent look over our procedures, look over our skills, and make sure that we're flying in a safe manner. So it's a really good way for us to make sure that our technical and non-technical skills remain at a safe standard. That's the primary purpose of the flight review. So let's have a look at a couple of case studies where flight reviews or lack thereof were considered to be a potential causal factor in the accident itself. We can never really say for sure that, if these pilots had followed the procedures, the accident wouldn't have happened. It's really difficult to do that. But I think it's fair to say that had that happened, the accident was a lot less likely to have occurred. In our first accident, this one includes or involves a beach bonanza for anyone who's flown the bonanza, and it occurred at Bathurst Island in the Northern Territory in June of 2006. Of course, when something bad happens, the ATSB does a fairly extensive accident investigation, and they try and work out what happened. In this respect, it was a flight from Kununurra to Bathurst Island. It was a private operator in his own aeroplane, and he was going to visit a remote client, if I remember right. The first indication that something went wrong was at 0900 when another aircraft at Bathurst Island detected a 121.5 beacon. So they reported that to air traffic control, and air traffic control dispatched a search aircraft. Search aircraft arrives at Bathurst Island at 1100, and they locate the wreckage of the bonanza that had come from Kununurra, about 2.4 kilometres northwest of the island's aerodrome. A rescue chopper was dispatched at that point. They arrived at 12:20, and they put a couple of medics down onto the scene in the bushed area where the aircraft was, and they found the pilot. The pilot had been able to extricate himself from the wreckage, but sadly had died as a result of his injuries in the meantime. So it was a very sad accident, fatal accident. The ATSB commenced their investigation to see what went wrong. Now, they'll look at all aspects of the accident, of course. The wreckage site, which we can see here, a lot can be learned from that. In this case, what they saw was that the aircraft accident where it hit the trees and where the aircraft fuselage ended up was actually quite a small area. This indicates that it was quite a vertical impact, which is normally indicative of something like a stall. They looked at the fuel system and they saw that there are a number of things of interest with the fuel system. There was also some radar returns from air traffic control, and they saw the aircraft actually made it to the circuit area of Bathurst Island, joined on a left downwind and an extended centre line for the runway. When the ATSB looked at the fuel system, they found a couple of things. For anyone who's familiar with the Bonanza, you know you can get a couple of optional tip tanks. So the fuel selector has 5 positions. There's off, left main, right tip, and left tip. There's a type certificate supplement for the Bonanza, which says that the tip tanks, because they're gravity fed, should not be used in other than level flight. So a number of the checklists in the Bonanza call for the main tank with the most fuel in it being selected for things like landing in the circuit. So it's not normal to use the tip tanks for the landing procedure. When they looked at the tip tanks at the wreckage site, neither of those tanks contained any usable amount of fuel. So the left tank was found, that was intact, that had approximately 65 litres of fuel in it. So there was usable fuel on the aircraft at the time of the accident. And they found that the aircraft fuel selector was in the right tip position. So the problem with that is twofold. First of all, because the aircraft was in the landing phase, the checklist called for one of the main tanks to be selected, the one that had the most fuel. The other problem, of course, was that the right tip tank had no fuel in it. So they strongly suspect that this was a fuel starvation type incident. So when they went back and looked at the refuels of the aircraft and how much flying it had done since then, they estimated that there was approximately 216 litres of usable fuel on board. So it was deemed that the most likely scenario that the ATSB came up with was that everything pointed towards one of these fuel starvation type incidents. Look, I've been with CASA for 12 years now, and the fuel starvation type incident, fuel starvation or exhaustion, and the VFR into IMC type incident are persistent accidents. We're making those same errors over and over again, and it looks like this is what happened in this case. So what they saw, and when they worked out how this could have been avoided, is if the pilot was doing normal checks, normal pre-landing checks, it would have included the check to select the main tank with the most fuel. So they can only surmise that the checklist was either not being done or that it was being done incorrectly. Another point that they raised or they found in the investigation was this one. When they looked at the pilot's logbook, the pilot being issued a PPL in 2002, the accident occurred in 2006, there was no record of any flight reviews for this pilot. Clearly, in that 4-year period, there should have been at least one in there. So they went back to the local aero clubs, anyone who'd been associated with this pilot, and they tried to find out if there was any evidence of any AFRs having been done. There was one entry in an instructor's logbook from 2005, which was a 1.6-hour flight with this pilot, short navigation, if I remember rightly, and that was annotated as an AFR, but the instructor couldn't actually really remember what was included in the flight and whether there are any deficiencies in performance. So whilst it is possible an AFR was done in this period, there seems to be no record in the pilot's record of it, and nor what was included in the AFR. So whether it was a complete and effective AFR really couldn't be determined. And we'll get back to how that AFR may have prevented that accident after we talk about the second case study. But clearly, on an AFR, things like fuel management, checklist usage, etc., would have been noted or should have been noted by an instructor and perhaps brought back to standard. That being the case, like most of these accidents we see, they're actually pretty easily avoidable when you look at the core reason they happen. And in this case, had the pilot done the checklist actions properly, the accident likely wouldn't have happened. Had the pilot monitored and managed fuel effectively, the accident likely wouldn't have happened. And both of those things really are things that would be included in a flight review. Case study 2 is that other type of accident that I talked about, the VFR pilot flying into IMC. If we look at the details of this one, this was a Mooney M20J. The accident occurred in Coffs Harbour in New South Wales, and it was in 2019. Again, the dates are really important here when we're talking about the application of flight reviews to flight safety. So the accident occurred in 2019. It was a private flight, pilot and 1 passenger. So the idea, if you can see that map, is they were going from the Wollumbar up the north there to Taree in the south. Unfortunately, they didn't make it. Due to weather, the pilot tried to go through Class C airspace, which sits over Coffs Harbour, and requested clearance to do so, but that clearance was denied. Despite the fact that the clearance was denied, the pilot entered Class C airspace for approximately a minute and then descended out of it. Both the forecast and the observed weather on this day were really bad. It was clearly not conditions conducive to VFR flight. The pilot descended to clear of the controlled airspace, and the weather reported from observers at that time in that area was cloud down to the ground. The aircraft impacted terrain not far out of Coffs Harbour. So private flight, 1 passenger. Weather was particularly bad on this day, certainly not VFR conditions. Once the aircraft didn't arrive at Taree, the alarm was raised and the wreckage was found at 26 kilometres from Coffs. When the ATSB went back and looked at the preparation for flight, they couldn't find any NAIPS logging for this particular flight. And in fact, for this pilot, they couldn't find NAIPS logins for any of his flights. So we can surmise from that NAIPS wasn't accessed to check weather. So the ATSB will then try and look to see if there were any other attempts to access weather or get copies of weather. And they found that in the wreckage, there was no copies of the weather. There were about, I think it was 2 phones and 1 laptop computer in the wreckage. None of them had any electronic flight bag type apps on them to access weather. So there's absolutely no evidence that this pilot accessed weather for this flight on a day that was particularly bad weather. That was the accident site there. What they found from this particular accident site when they looked at it is that there was no mechanical fault that they could identify with the aircraft. Due to the shape of the propeller and the bending of the propeller, they surmised that it was under power when the aircraft hit the tree, so it doesn't look like it was an engine failure or fuel problem. Both tanks had ruptured, both fuel tanks, and there was a strong odour of fuel at the crash site, which indicated there was a significant amount of fuel there. They did find 2 charts in this wreckage, but they are both out-of-date maps, and they were both in a nav bag, so they don't believe they were being accessed during the flight. And as I mentioned before, there were no electronic flight bags found in the wreckage. When they interviewed a couple of people that knew this pilot, it was found out that he was in the habit of navigating using an unapproved GPS unit, which was pretty much just sat in his lap for his flights. So it appears that this pilot there was no evidence that he was accessing weather, and there was no evidence that he was using up-to-date charts, using proper nav technique, and only using the GPS for a backup sort of situational awareness tool, which is really all it should be used for. So the ATSB surmised from the evidence, given the fact that there was nothing wrong with the aircraft that they could see, the weather was really bad on this particular day, that the aircraft descended into high terrain in conditions that are below VMC, and that led to an impact with that terrain and the fatality of the 2 people, the pilot and the passenger. And again, in my 12 years in CASA, this is a persistent type of accident that we just can't seem to stamp out, and we're really trying our best to do that. So the dates are important here. Let's have a look at a few dates when the ATSB went back and looked at the record of this pilot and the history of this pilot. This pilot had a PPL issued in 1982. he kept minimal records, or certain minimal records that could be found by the ATSB. They did find one logbook, and that in that particular logbook, there was a flight review recorded in January 2010. So between the PPL issue in 1982 and the flight book log in 2010 for a flight review, there was no record of any flight review being done in that period. When Part 61 was introduced in 2014, you might remember before that, your flight reviews were entered into your logbook, but after that, they were entered onto your licence, and they were also annotated to CASA, so we would have a record of them. Since 2014, when Part 61 came in, CASA had no record of any flight review being conducted by this pilot. So we can say certainly before 2014, the only evidence we have of a flight review was in 2010, but we can say with some certainty after 2014 that there were no flight reviews done. The ATSB even went so far as to go to the local aero clubs that this pilot was involved with to ask them, had he done any flight reviews that may not have been recorded, and they couldn't find anyone who could recall that happening. The accident occurred in 2019. So when we look at the flight review schedule, licence issued in 1982, one flight review in 2010, accident occurred in 2019. Even if there are a couple of flight reviews in there that we didn't have evidence for, that is clearly nowhere near the standard that needs to be met to keep this pilot safe. So I think this is quite an extreme example of lack of flight reviews leading to a really bad outcome. But again, we can't say for certain that had those flight reviews been done, the accident wouldn't have occurred, but I think it is fair to say that the chances would have been greatly diminished. This is a really long quote, but a really important one. And I'm going to give you a minute just to read that for yourself. Hopefully you can see that on the screens. So as you can see there, that's a comment from the ATSB included in this accident report. And again, I'll include the links in the chat for the accident reports. And it really just does highlight what we're saying here. Flight reviews are not just to bring our skills for the normal stuff up to date. It's to bring our skills up for the things we're not expecting and how we're going to deal with those things when it goes wrong. So I think that's a really important quote, albeit a long one. And I hope that's one that you can sort of take away with you after today and reflect on. So we've talked now about sort of the safety implications of not doing our flight reviews, why we do flight reviews and what can happen, potentially happen if we don't follow that procedure. Let's have a talk now about the legalities. Don't worry about if you can't read that slide. I'm going to expand the important bits in a moment. But this is Part 61, and Part 61 gives us the legal requirements that we as private and recreational pilots have with respect to flight reviews. So the important bit is this one that I've sort of expanded out here. It's 61745. Limitations on exercises of privileges of aircraft class ratings flight review. And what it says is a holder of an aircraft class rating is authorised to exercise the privileges of the rating only if the holder has a valid flight review for the rating. Plain and simple. If your flight review is not current, your licence is not able to be used. It's as simple as that. So from a legal perspective, if we fly and we don't have a current flight review, we leave ourselves open to all sorts of adverse actions. From CASA, we can take action against pilots that aren't properly licensed or properly holding a flight review, to all sorts of other things that might impact on us. Insurance companies, for example, if we damage our aircraft, if it's known that our license wasn't valid at the time, I think it's highly unlikely they'd pay out on a claim. So there's all sorts of things that can happen if we don't have that. So that's one of the legalities we as pilots need to think about with respect to flight reviews. Now, it says that we have to do a flight review. Again, don't worry too much if you can't read this slide because I'll expand it out for you. But we need to know, okay, well, if I have to do a flight review, what are the minimum requirements that I must legally cover to make it a relevant flight review? Well, the Manual of Standards, Part 61 Manual of Standards helps us there. So if we just sort of expand this bit out a bit, what I've done is I've highlighted in blue the elements of the flight review which may have helped prevent the first accident. The yellow bits are the ones that may have helped prevent the second accident. So in the blue bit there, manage aircraft systems. This should be included in your flight review. Ensure sufficient fuel is loaded and fuel consumption is monitored and managed throughout the flight. And that would have obviously prevented that accident. The second point there is manage the aircraft fuel system. Again, had that been done, we probably wouldn't be talking about that accident. Some of the requirements, like manage aircraft systems, are mandatory in a flight review. Some are optional. You'll notice here with the navigation, for example, that's optional. However, I think if you are a pilot that conducts regular, cross-country flights, I would just think of it as mandatory. I do. You need to keep those skills up to date. So in that case, for the navigation, navigate en route using visual and instrument navigation systems and perform diversion procedures. Had that pilot been competent in both of those, amongst other things, weather analysis, etc., I think it's unlikely that accident wouldn't occur. That's just part of the MOS. There's more. There's another section there, and I'll highlight a few bits here as well. With respect to instrument flying, the yellow for that second accident, perform basic flight manoeuvres using full instrument panel, recover from upset situations and unusual aircraft attitudes to straighten level flight. Even if we plan properly, we do everything correctly in the air, there's still a possibility that we might encounter reduced visibility conditions. It can be bushfire smoke, it can be dust storm, it can be oil on the windscreen, it can be all sorts of things. So we really need some basic skills in instrument flying to keep us safe in those situations, and that's reflected in the manual standards requirements for flight review. Further down, there's recognise and manage threats and errors. Had that pilot had a look at the weather, there was a huge threat there to be recognised that it clearly wasn't VMC conditions. And of course, there's assess situations and make appropriate decisions. Decision making is a really big one, and in fact, the subject of a separate series of our webinars altogether. For the first accident in blue, then manage a simulated complete engine failure and execute a forced landing. It's surmised from where the accident was in that first one, because it was in bushland close to a clear area, that he may have been trying to stretch the glide to get to that clear area and unfortunately stalled as a result. So I hope you can sort of link those manual standards elements back to the legal requirement to do the flight review, to then link them back to the safety reasons we do a flight review. The bad old days of grabbing an instructor, doing 2 circuits and getting a tick in the box never really improved flight safety to any great extent. It really wasn't what the flight review was designed to do. The manual standards will clearly outline what we need to do these days, and it'll keep us safe. So to expand on that a little bit more, we're really lucky to be joined by Jared Rowe. As I mentioned before, he's the head of operations at the Royal Aero Club of WA. He's got a lot of experience with doing his own flight reviews and conducting flight reviews for other people. He's a flight examiner, very experienced instructor. So I'm going to hand over to Jared now, and he's going to give his thoughts on flight reviews and how they're conducted. So over to you, Jared.
Thanks, Craig. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, can hear you fine.
Beautiful. All right. Welcome, everybody. First of all, as I got to say, thanks for joining us on Valentine's Day. Your Valentine's Day has been made very special for the fact you get to watch Craig for a little bit of today's presentation. Before I begin as well, it's interesting, Craig's case studies that he brought up. So, for example, we tend to have a look and we notice these things and we read up about them. And the ones that you tend to notice are the things for the aircraft that you may have flown, you may have seen around, other bits and pieces. And the second case study he brings up is an interesting one, because I'd spent a lot of hours in that aircraft with the previous owner. And it's just one of those things where you see it's one of those huge killers with VFR pilots flying into IFR. And for those of you who aren't aware of the dangers of it, hopefully one of the guys can put the link up. But CASA has a very good video on it called 176 Seconds to Live, where it just highlights the dangers of VFR pilots flying into IMC conditions or IFR conditions. So I'll begin with the points basically, and the main thing I want to stress today when it comes to a flight review is don't stress. It's not a flight test, it's a flight review. Okay, so one of the things to note is the fact that it's a dual exercise with an instructor. So a lot of people tend to get into a panic state about this, and they wonder, they're worried. But remember, it is a dual exercise. If you need assistance with it, you'll get assistance with it. That's exactly how the system is designed. I used to laugh. I used to work down south, and people would rock up and they'd be, all right, cool, here for the flight review. A lot of pilots were on their own aircraft. and you'd have a look and you go through the paperwork and you go, well, your flight review's not valid. Yeah, that's why I'm here to do it. How did you get here? I flew here. So we've got to make sure that we watch out for things like that. And one of the reasons that CASA can help you get around that as well is the fact of period of validity. And you can do them within 3 months of the expiry date, and it's not going to affect your expiry date for the next one as well. So something to keep in mind, that you do have time to do it. So as I mentioned before, it's a flight review, not a flight test. So if there is anything that is the issue, then that's fine. That's exactly what you're there, is to help work it out. The other thing is, everything that you need is in front of you. It's in the manual standards, as Craig has mentioned. All the items that you need to do are there. All your flight test tolerances that you need to do in the appropriate sections of the MOS. Now, the other thing is, depending on what you're doing. So as a RPL or a PPL holder, you'll be at the private standards, whereas CPL, ATPL, you'll be at the professional standards. So the goalposts are also there. So again, you've got everything that you're going to do. You know the tolerances you're going to have a look at. One thing, or I'll segregate between the two, look at a test versus a flight review, is the fact that the steep turn. Steep turn's always the example I like to use for this. So if we look at a steep turn for an RPL or a PPL holder at the private standards, you got plus or minus 150 feet. Cool. So if you go and do the exercise and you go plus 100, minus 50, plus 70, minus 80, plus 30, minus 120, roll out, you're within the tolerances. But the way a flight test looks at it is they also look at the separate elements of how you fly the aeroplane, the judgment, the accuracy, the technique. So you could argue that they're off, that a person could not maintain an altitude within. However, in the flight review process, you may have a result like that. The instructor will say, let's have a look at one the other direction. That's good. And then you try again back in the first direction. One or two things can happen. You can do it again. You can be fine. Great. You move on. Or you have another attempt and it's not great. Then the instructor may demonstrate it to you. Then you have a crack at it and then it's all good. The box is now ticked and you move on. So as again, a stress, it's not a test. It's not a pass fail. They're there to help you. And it depends on how you go as well. If you do have a flight where you don't need any assistance, well, the good news is you can put it in your logbook as ICAS. If you're unsure, simply ask the instructor at the end. So as we mentioned, don't stress. The other thing this is good for is, as Craig has mentioned, in the professional world, we have to do a lot of checks. So, for example, on a yearly basis, I've got to do things like IPCs, FPCs, EPCs, standardization. So I'm constantly flying and getting checked. Now, for the private pilot, you may not necessarily be doing it. The other thing that also happens is, if you're someone who always goes flying with passengers, then you're not going to be able to do emergency procedures. So things like your stalls, your steep turns, you might not be practicing with people on board, and practice forced landings. So these are the opportunities you've got now to brush up on those emergency procedures, because when it goes and it happens, it's never going to happen at an ideal time. And you've got to ask, who's in the plane with you? Whose life is in your hands? So it's a good way to practice it. Then once that's all done, ticked off, then you're happy to go for another 2 years. Now, there is a theory component beforehand. So, for example, how we run them, we send the candidate the questionnaire beforehand. There's 50 questions, multi-choice. We go through the questionnaire. It's a good way to test a grade memory, especially if there's been some rule changes, and then go out and do the flight. The flight isn't necessarily long either. I've had flights that are usually around about 1.3 to people who are proficient, and we get everything ticked off, all working well, job's done, and then they can move on. Now, there's the optional elements as well. You might have caught it on Craig's slide. So, for example, if you're someone who doesn't tend to stretch your legs too far with your flying, then it's a good idea to maybe every second flight review, have a look at the navigational elements. Go and practice a short navigational exercise with an instructor. The other thing you can do is take the opportunity to upskill. If you're someone who is hesitant of doing something because you haven't done it for a while, use this as a procedure to brush up. Maybe something as simple as a controlled airspace. You haven't gone and done any controlled airspace for a while. It's a good opportunity to then get back into it. The other thing is, your club or your flying school may have got a new aircraft. Let's say you're endorsed with a PPL and you have no design feature endorsements. They may have got an Arrow or a 182, for example. So what can you do? You can do a CSU, a manual propeller pitch control, retractable undercarriage with your instructor. Now, under the old Car 5 system, for those of you who have been around long enough, you remember that when you did that, that then constituted a flight review. It doesn't now, but while you're doing the flight, do the additional elements, and then you can have that ticked off as well. So you can think about upskilling, and it doesn't have to be a design feature endorsement. It could be a flight activity endorsement you want to do, such as formation or aerobatics as well. You can really think about what you want to do. Now, different things need different flight reviews as well. So, for example, a night VFR or a low level or a PIPA also need flight reviews as well. People will then choose how they want to do these. I've had people, for example, with the night VFR flight review, they'll choose to do it all in one big hit. So we'll do a flight, we'll do some day work, we'll do some night work, we come back, and then we sign both off at the same time. Then I've got people who prefer to space them out. So then that way they get a checkup every 12 months. So 1 year they'll do the day flight review, 1 year they'll do the night flight review, and so forth. So when you do those, use it as an opportunity. Even some of you who might be out in regional areas who don't have access to other things, think of this as an opportunity. Can you go somewhere for a couple of days? Can you add controlled aerodrome, controlled airspace to your license if you don't already have them? Have a look for those and see what you can do. Again, with the upskilling, use it to your advantage as well. So, as I said to you, you've got those optional elements that you can choose to add on as well, but it's really looking at those emergency procedures, the things that you might not be practicing on a day-to-day basis, and the instructors are here to help you. The good thing is, if you know a flight instructor as well, and you don't need any remedial training, they don't need to operate under a 141, 142 to do your flight review. However, if there is any training required, then they must be employed under a 141 or 142 to do so. And then going back to the original point, don't stress. If something isn't to standard and it needs another flight, then so be it. Look at the emergency procedures that we don't practice. I'll use that as an example. Your PFL's not great. Every other box is ticked and it's all good. But the last PFL you did was 2 years ago on your flight review. So you simply then go out with the instructor for a second flight, go practice the PFL again until it's to standard, you come back, and then you do the paperwork. It's not uncommon for people to have to take more than one flight review if it's something they haven't done for a long time, or if they've simply been out of the loop and not flown for 2 or 3 years, full stop. So don't beat yourself down on it. Again, don't stress. Apart from that, I just put it down to the point where, remember, everybody makes mistakes. That's why pencils have erasers. So it's okay for it to be a dual exercise. It's okay to need a second flight. And as I said, use it as an opportunity to be able to upskill yourself, add an extra rating, add an extra feature, and then use it to then make yourself a more proficient and therefore a safer pilot for you and for your passengers. Going back to my original point as well, where I talked about the crash, whether it was a pilot of going into IMC and he was a VFR pilot, CASA's got the PIFA now as well, which is designed for private pilots to be able to take on those conditions under the IMC. Again, to be able to expand your skills, and it opens the envelope to more flights that you can take. Apart from that, I hope you guys have enjoyed Craig's presentation. Thanks for joining us on Valentine's Day, and I'll hang about to answer any questions that anybody's got.
Thanks, Jared. That was fantastic. There's a slide there that just summarises some of the points that Jared was making, and I certainly hope people got something out of that very useful information there in Jared's experience. So thanks again. So, ladies and gentlemen, we've got a lot of resources available to help you prepare for your flight review, to help you in between flight reviews if you want to upskill or keep your skills current in between. We've got the CASA website. And on the website, we've got the Pilot Safety Hub. There's all sorts of stuff there for you, videos and the like. Under the Resources and Education tab, you'll find a whole bunch of stuff, and I'm going to put some of the links in the chat, as I mentioned earlier. Also, in the latest online version of our Aviation Flying Safety magazine, we've got an article on flight reviews, so I'd commend that one to you. It won't be in the printed version, but it is in the online version. So again, from the CASA website, you can find our magazine and hopefully find that article. So we're going to do some questions now. I'm just going to address some of the questions and comments in the chat section first, and then we'll see if anyone else has got any residual questions. So if we start with Barry, thanks for that. Barry says, why doesn't CASA check up on pilots not doing flight reviews? You seem to collect the necessary data. And then, I think it's Mohammed talks about, yes, there should be spot checks, unexpected checks. So I always equate this back to driving a car. you have to have a license to drive a car. There's a lot of people who will drive a car with a suspended license or no license. The police do try and catch them. They have certain resources to do that, and they have to balance the risk versus how much money is spent on policing. Well, CAS is in exactly the same boat, albeit not to the same extent. To police everyone having a flight review would mean a ramp check system that would be unsustainable, financially for the government, I would suggest, but also not necessary. The vast majority of pilots do the right thing. In my experience with my time in CASA, if someone doesn't have a valid flight review, it's normally off by a little bit and it's by error that they didn't notice it. So we correct that and we move on. Yes, every now and then we get people who clearly are out to break the rules, but thankfully they are in the minority. So we do try and balance policing, this sort of thing, versus the risk that's involved, versus the culture, the professional culture, if you like, of the people we're dealing with. And in the aviation world, most pilots, most engineers are actually, whether they're professional or recreational, are actually trying to do the right thing because, it's really important for their own life to do that. So we think we've got the balance right, but, it could always be that little bit better. But we do try and keep an eye on it, and ramp checks is one way that we do that. Someone mentioned they didn't see the ATSB quote, so sorry about that. That was Dave. I'll put that in the chat as well so that you've got that for later on. Andrew, thanks for your question. He says, I gather a new type rating ticks the box for a flight review. And Jared, I'm wondering if I can give that one to you. Will doing a new type rating constitute a flight review as well at the same time?
Yeah, so if you're looking specifically on type ratings, then as long as the elements are all covered, then yes, it will re-energize or revalidate your rating as well. It's not necessarily types as well, it's also classes too. So for example, if you added a multi-engine class rating on top of your single, then your multi will then cover you for your single as well, but not vice versa.
Thanks, mate. That's great. Paul was asking if, as an instrument-rated private pilot licence, his IPC replaces a flight review. Well, Paul, I'd refer you back to the MOS on that one, the MOS standard for a flight review. You'll have to do all of the visual requirements as well that are in the MOS. So you can do it all in one flight if you've got the time, but just an IPC won't really cover flight review. Would you agree, Jared?
If you've got, it's like you said, if you've got the elements in there. So I don't know how every testing officer works theirs, but usually with the IPC elements, you'll see that the IPC will then cover it for class ratings as well, valid by your IPC in the MOS.
Thanks, mate. Barry asks, are you expected to do the AFR in the plane you usually fly? From what Jared is saying, that may not be the case. It's a class rating, so as long as the aircraft is in the class rating that you're getting the flight review for, you can use that aircraft. Les Sullivan asks, how would AFR prevent VFR into IMC? That's a really good question, Les, and I think that sort of goes to the crux of what we're talking about here. How is the flight review system and the elements within it trying to prevent this? Well, it won't prevent everything. We know that some people know what the rules are, but they disregard them. Only recently we saw a pilot involved in a very sad fatal accident who didn't even hold a licence. So there will always be people that slip through the net. But how does a flight review for somebody who's trying to do the right thing? Well, you may not, and I get this question a lot when we do our seminars, you may have got a bit rusty in weather, decoding weather forecasts. All of us who hold a licence at one point were competent in decoding weather and applying it to our VFR flying. The chat is sort of indicating from some people that it's got harder in some way, but it hasn't. Our skills have just perished, basically. So with a flight review, if you look at the elements within the manual of standards, the recognition of threats, the flight planning, etc., will mean that an instructor is watching you and helping you make sure that you're decoding that weather correctly and then applying it to your flight with respect to fuel planning, diversion requirements, etc. So if we get someone to check our skills are up to date on that, bring them back up to standard, and if they're not, I believe that's how the flight review could prevent VFR into IMC accidents. Also, with respect to the instrument training that I mentioned as part of the manual standards requirements, if even though we do everything right, we end up in poor visibility, if we have done instrument training as part of our flight review, personally, I think we should do it a lot more often than that. But if we do that, it gives us a better chance of being able to handle the aircraft safely in IMC conditions or poor visibility, get it to a safe height, and then get radar or air traffic control or assistance from other pilots to get us out of that area into better visibility. So I think the AFR system is really important for preventing those VFR into IMC type accidents, because it'll give us the skills to stay out of those conditions, and it'll give us the skills to deal with those conditions should we inadvertently get into them. I will share a link for the relevant MOS, Naomi. It'll take you to the MOS. There'll still be a bit of scrolling through to get it, but that will be in the chat. And a couple of other comments there. So does anyone have a question they would like to ask via the microphone at this point? Doesn't look like anything at the moment. Well, that being said, in a short while, I'm going to put those links up in the chat for you so that you can go to those. I will put my email in there as well, as I mentioned. Please email me if you've got any residual questions, comments, things that you think we might be able to do better in this particular format. Once again, thanks to Jared for joining us. He's given up his time to be with us today, which we really appreciate, because we know the Aero Club, like pretty much all Aero Clubs around Australia at the moment, are very busy, and his time's very valuable. So thanks so much, Jared, for that really good input and valuable information that you've shared. Thanks to people for attending. We know you've got busy lives, so it's really good of you to come along, spend this time with us. I hope today's presentation has given you one or two things at least to reflect on that you think, yep, that's something I could probably lift my game a little bit with there, or I understand a bit better now. And feel free to contact myself or any of the other CASA aviation safety advisors around Australia. You can get us through the website. We're always happy to help you out, give information, or point you in the right direction if we don't have the information. Enjoy the rest of the day, ladies and gentlemen. Safe flying, and thanks so much again for joining us.